whatever I think it was Washington Post, though, whatever site
Yeah.
stole our content.
Yeah.
That was paywalled content. And I literally paid for like they had like $1 thing. I paid $1 because I was like, oh, let's see if they stole our content. Or if they gave us credit. And so I got an email from them today and they were like, you might want to consider updating your payment method. And I responded with, you might want to consider not hiring fucking plagiarizing assholes who steal content. And
what a response.
Yeah, dude, that's fuck awesome. Them. What's crazy is if I never got that email, I would have just probably forgotten about it and paid for like years and then been like, oh my God, I've been giving. Now I'm definitely going to unsubscribe. I'm going to remember now with that email in our history. So fuck them, dude. God.
This is Hot Hand Theory. This is a podcast where we talk about the NBA and break things down from an analytical perspective. I'm your co-host, XJ. As always, he is my brilliant co-host, Geoff. Geoff, the New York Knicks have been eliminated from the postseason by the Indiana Pacers. The Pacers move on to the Eastern Conference Finals. We have a ton to talk about regarding the series, the Knicks season, and what they'll do moving forward. I have a feeling we're going to have some different opinions from maybe dramatically different opinions from things you're hearing around Knicks land. So this will be very interesting. But before we get started, I did want to say a couple of things. One, Hot Hand Theory is not going anywhere. We'll be locked in for the rest of the playoffs. We'll be previewing the 2 conference finals series as well. And we'll be here, until a title is crowned, a champion is crowned. And 2, we just want to thank everyone who's listened to the podcast at any point during our first season ever of Hot Hand Theory. We've talked about this before, but in year 1, it's been so successful and has resonated beyond what, Geoff, I'll speak for you, beyond what either of us could have ever imagined. It's really hard to start a new podcast, like harder than you would think, and to have people listen. We've put a ton of effort into our thoughts and our perspectives and ideas, into editing, into trying to be creative. We're literally not just like cutting on the video and recording once a week. There's a lot of thought that's going into it. So we're really happy about the success. And I just want to plug one last time, which is that, we're coming up upon an amazing milestone for us at 500 subscribers on YouTube, which would make us like a tier 1 YouTube partner. And we really appreciate, if you've enjoyed our content at any point this season, give a subscribe. Just hit the subscribe button real quick right now. It would be cool. But even if you don't, either way, we really appreciate everyone who listens, whether they agree or disagree, and everyone's engagement with our content. So just wanted to say that real quick before we got started. Geoff, any thoughts from you, sir?
I think it's cool that you took a shot at how this pod would be run if you weren't on it. Like you were like, yeah, if I wasn't here, they basically just would have cut the pod and it would have just been posted, because that's what I would have done. So when we have like the cool edits and stuff, just know that XJ is the brilliance behind that. I do a little bit with the social media, but like XJ is really, really talented, and you should subscribe just to see more of the really sick stuff that he does. Like the Anthony Edwards video we posted on YouTube today. It will be right at your disposal if you just hit that subscribe button. We really appreciate you. I second all of your thoughts. We appreciate you with it.
Doing a little bit with the social media is like a really funny way to say growing a social media from 0 to over 2,000 followers in one season, which is account.
when we passed your account, I was gonna text you to make fun of you. Just be like this is under a year. Just fucking nailed it. But
I was excited. I was rooting for him. Like, I hope we pass me. And then it was just like, yeah. And maybe like 6 months into year 1, we passed me. Anyway,
it's crazy because we talked about again, this stuff doesn't really matter. It matters for the YouTube. That's like why we're pushing this so much. It matters for the YouTube because there's things we can do that we can't do until we hit 500 subscribers. So that's why, if you're not subscribed, please do. But like, we're not like sitting there counting Twitter followers. That stuff doesn't really matter. The content that we make for Twitter, we do because we're trying to. I mean, for the same reason we started this podcast, we're trying to improve sounds arrogant, but we're just trying to present help the conversation and the narratives, and just present data and marry it to film, and do so in an interesting way that we know there are a lot of smart people out there who don't have the time or just don't want to, but are interested in the NBA and the Knicks and any other team, the way we are, and we're just trying to help in that way. But it was cool to, start from scratch and just see how fast everyone resonated with the type of content we're doing over there. So again, thank you for that.
Absolutely, for sure. I second all of that. On to the Pacers-Knicks recap, which is where we'll start. The Knicks fall to the Pacers in 7 games after being up 2-0 in the series. I think you and I, Geoff, would agree that the series turned when OG Anunoby strained his hamstring in the third quarter of game 2. The first 2 games, with OG Anunoby on the court, the biggest thing that stands out to me is that Pascal Siakam was essentially a non-factor. And honestly, I would argue he was a clear negative for the Pacers during those first 2 games. Without OG, the Knicks had no one to guard Siakam. That didn't severely hurt their offense. And, for what, better or worse, they weren't going to be okay with them going off from kind of like short mid-range area. I think what's really interesting to me is that, and we'll talk about this more probably later, I don't think the Knicks miss Julius Randle as much as they should miss a multi-time All-NBA player, in my opinion. But without OG, Julius Randle would have been really helpful to battle with Siakam on the defensive end. Basically, the Knicks were missing 2 of the players that would have been the ones with the primary matchup against Siakam. So that seemed to be a little too much. With the Pacers team, you can't really get into help. You can't just help and get into rotation. They're too spaced out. They have too many really good shooters. That's just going to be death to your defense. And the Knicks would never be content to just let Siakam go for 46 points, 2 points at a time. That was just never going to happen. So he ended up really, really hurting them without OG and then, without Julius Randle. So that was a big thing that stuck out to me. But, you can talk about that or any other big things that stuck out to you from this series.
I just thought, to your point, and I think it's going to relate to, something we'll talk about later in the episode. I just don't think that the Knicks handled Siakam the best way possible. I thought that putting OG on him to start was the right decision. I think OG is the Knicks, not obviously their best defender overall. He's their best on-ball defender against most people, not guards, not like Tyrese Maxey in round 1. I thought they handled Maxey really well after starting the series poorly. But we talked about before the series, there's only one direction the Knicks could have gone in, and that was putting OG Anunoby on Siakam and putting DiVincenzo or Hart at the point of attack on Halliburton. Because what that allows you to do is OG Anunoby is not only your best on-ball defender, but he's also your best off-ball defender. He's the most impactful free safety roamer that the Knicks have. And so with Siakam's biggest offensive weakness being 3-point shooting, it allows Anunoby to make Siakam's life the most difficult when he's in his best environment on the ball, but also when he is hurting the team the most as a spacer. It also simultaneously amplifies or maximizes Anunoby's off-ball impact and allows him to cover for his teammates. So I thought that was the clear play. They did it. I was surprised after Anunoby got hurt, they didn't follow similar logic with Isaiah Hartenstein or Precious Achiuwa. They did so for moments, but they really, really wanted Josh Hart to be the guy to guard Siakam. And what that did was it forced Isaiah Hartenstein away from the rim because he was always on Miles Turner when Josh Hart was guarding Siakam. I just mentioned that, putting OG Anunoby on Siakam was a double positive. This is a double negative because Isaiah Hartenstein is your most important rim protector. He's your best rebounder. And when you have him only on Miles Turner, it takes him away from the basket. It neuters his defensive impact. And he was second in the NBA in defensive EPM. You're trying to maximize his impact. If you cross-matched those two matchups, if you put Josh Hart on Miles Turner and you put Isaiah Hartenstein on Siakam or Precious Achiuwa, who was more effective in the series than Hartenstein in some of these minutes, you're now putting your best rim protector closer to the basket. You're now letting him be that sort of free safety guy to help off Siakam when Siakam's off the ball, and he's starting closer to the rim. And you're also putting your biggest, best one-on-one defender on Siakam when he's going one-on-one. And I just don't think that the Knicks did that enough. I thought that was a huge misstep. I thought they enabled Siakam to be his best self later in the series, and that shows in the numbers. Siakam shot a ridiculous 52%, 52% XJ from 5 feet to the 3-point line, which if he struggled in games 1 and 2 with OG on him, he sure didn't overall for the series. 52% from 5 feet to the 3-point line is remarkably effective. He was 69% from 10 to 14 feet. 69% from 10 to 14 feet, which is unbelievable. Almost 1.4 points per possession on 2-pointers. With the greatest offense of all time, shooting only 2-pointers in this series from Pascal Siakam from a certain range. And the Pacers offense, it reflects how important Siakam was as the series went on. They had 127 offensive rating when Siakam played, 110 offensive rating when he didn't play. Me and XJ have disagreed on how important Siakam can be to this team. And when I was making my argument for why I supported the Siakam trade, one of the things that I pointed to was Siakam's ability to, at the end of the shot clock, create high efficiency baskets when no one else could. Halliburton does a lot of things well. He's not a guy like Jalen Brunson you give the ball to and he creates a really efficient look at the end of the shot clock. In my opinion, they needed that guy. And Siakam, when OG Anunoby was out of the series, was that guy. He hit a bunch of huge baskets late in the shot clock, kept their offense going in game 7 when, look, their offense wasn't going to be stopped, but when there were moments when it seemed like the Knicks had a chance in that game. And when the Pacers weren't able to get out in transition and get great 3-pointers early in the shot clock. And in those moments, Siakam stepped up and it seemed like he nailed a basket every single time. He nailed one of those high efficiency 2-pointers. So I thought Siakam was great. I do think you can point to OG Anunoby being out, but I do think that Siakam deserves praise for what he was able to do and to capitalize on the advantageous situation. And to the main gist of my point, I think the Knicks helped him and enabled him to be his best self, and I think they could have done more to stop him, even with OG Anunoby out.
Yeah, I agree with the vast majority of that. I think that it's so interesting where like the injury to OG Anunoby basically turned this series from a situation where Pascal Siakam's weaknesses would be exploited into a series where his strengths would be optimized. And it was like effectively night and day with OG on the court and OG not on the court. And that's generally true from what we've seen from the Knicks, honestly. Like, OG on the court, they're one team, OG off the court, they're another team. But at the same time, I think that the series really just completely swung with that injury. And a large part of it is because Siakam being able to exploit it. But I also think that it just really happened to go his way. It really just happened to go his way. We turned this situation into a place where Siakam could be totally maximized. And I don't think that would happen, even if just Julius Randle was there. Even if just Julius Randle is there, Siakam's not getting like deep positioning on Julius Randle where he can get, within 5 to 10 feet every time that he wants and be able to shoot over the top. You're still going to, Siakam, he would still have to beat you off the dribble. He would still have to hit long range shots, and that would just completely change his effectiveness. So definitely under certain circumstances, Siakam is extremely effective. They just so happened to be that the Knicks' specific injuries turned this into a series where it was completely advantageous in his favor, as well as their scheme against Siakam, which, to me, even if you wanted to play single coverage on him with Josh Hart or something like that, you kind of had to just live with him just beating you then. Just like, you can't say, like, who would believe that Siakam had 20 points in this game 7 that we just saw? Like, you would think Siakam had 50 points. He had 20 points throughout the entire game because the Knicks were just like, we're not going to let Pascal Siakam beat us. We're going to let everybody else beat us. We're going to get into rotation and let everyone else beat us. That, I don't know about that strategy. And so to me, that was a misstep. But at the same time, I'll say, there is something to be said with the injuries putting you at such a disadvantage. I was saying going into the game, whatever starting lineup decision is made, and I've been very outspoken about thinking that specific types of starting lineups would be better and that they should move in a certain direction. For game 7, I'm just like, whatever starting lineup decisions that the Knicks make is fine, because I don't know how injured these guys are. I don't, minutes. I don't, there's just too many variables going on. And so it's hard to hold it against them, just given the situation that they ended up being in with injuries. But I do think that there are some things they could have done better. But at the same time, if you're going to lose OG Anunoby, who I believe is clearly far and away the Knicks' second best player, second most important player. And you already have injuries to your potentially third best important player and third most impactful player. There's only so much you can survive. And losing OG Anunoby was just too much. And I think that's like the difference in the series. And we can talk about things from the Pacers standpoint, but I don't know if you have any comment on that part.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit less forgiving is the wrong word, but the injuries do matter, but I do think that there are things that the Knicks could have done to win this series. And with Porzingis out, and look, OG wasn't right in game 7, but if they were willing to let him try, he was getting closer. And I think it's fair to say that had the Knicks won the series in 5 or 6 games, OG would have been available at some point in an Eastern Conference Finals against Boston. And, Josh Hart, ab strain, who knows if that was overuse related or if it was just a freak injury. I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to claim to know.
By the way, a doctor wouldn't be able to tell you like definitively either. So it's almost not relevant, but yeah, maybe they have a better insight. But I just wanted to add that caveat. I think people are like, well, if you're a doctor, you would just know. It's like, no, you also wouldn't know, but that's fine.
I do think that the loss of OG is really important. We're in full agreement there, but I guess I just can't get past the thought that one day the Knicks might look back at these 2 seasons and be like, did they completely maximize their chances of going as far as possible? And I'm very confident that the answer is no last season in 2023. They played an 8 seed and like a really good 8 seed, an above average 8 seed that ended up making the finals, but an 8 seed nonetheless. And their best player, almost by far their best player, Jimmy Butler, missed one of the 6 games. They had to beat that to go to the Eastern Conference Finals. And I think you look back at some decisions made in that played right into Spo's hands. Spoelstra is the best coach in the NBA. And if you do things that he can exploit, he is going to exploit the fuck out of them. If you play RJ Barrett and Josh Hart together and put them 1 and 2 passes away from Jalen Brunson, he is going to make it so your offense goes from 4th in the NBA to the worst playoff offense. That's going to happen. And it happened. And so I think you can look back at that Heat series and think, okay, Julius Randle was clearly playing hurt, but they could have done things that gave them a better chance to win that series. And I think you can say the same thing about not only this series, but just these entire playoffs, and leading up to these entire playoffs. I think there are questions. And we talked last week about, extending Thibs and just Thibs as a coach. And I said something that I meant, and I feel just as strong about it. I said, when the rumors came out after game 5 that, we're going to extend Thibs. I said, like, the worst thing that could happen is they lose game 6 and 7. And the realization hits that, like, a lot of these questions still exist. And I think Tom Thibodeau is a very good basketball coach, but I still have the questions as to if he can be the guy to lead a team over the top. I think that question is still very prevalent. And I think questions about what he does to a team's ceiling, if a team can peak at the right time to win a championship, which it requires more than ever now with the parity across the league. It's really like you have to beat 4 teams that are going to make your life hard. It's very, very rare nowadays to have a first round matchup where you're just like, yep, we're winning this thing. Like, no, that's the league is deep now. You have to win 4 against 4 tough opponents. You have to play multiple different ways. And I don't know. I feel a little wonky just writing it off to, OG got hurt and they were screwed, because game 3 was theirs for the taking. And they had to win 2 of the last 5 games against a team that even without OG and Anunoby, they were better than. And they didn't do it. So I don't know if you feel differently or you agree, but it just feels a little gross to me to just be like, yeah, I mean, there's nothing they could do. I agree that there was nothing they could do in game 7. No one reasonable would be like, oh, they should have won game 7. No. Jalen fucking Brunson broke his hand in the 3rd quarter, and the opponent set a record for best shooting game in the history of the playoffs, not just game 7, but the playoffs. So, like, Yeah, they lost to a team that was playing basically at a higher level than any team has ever played in the history of the NBA offensively. I don't think it would be reasonable to be like, oh, Thibs should have made this adjustment. No. I'm trying to have like a nuanced, reasonable conversation here about what he could have controlled and what he couldn't have controlled. And I do think that there were things throughout the playoffs and leading up to the playoffs that, we talked about beforehand, like, hey, these things could have ramifications. Hey, playing Isaiah Hartenstein, who's never averaged more than 24 minutes a game in his entire career, these crazy minutes in January, that maybe that's going to come back to haunt them. And then Hartenstein got hurt, and I'm not sure he ever recovered. And you just keep pointing to these things, and it's like, yeah, the Knicks were a shell of themselves, and yeah, there were dominoes that fell that Thibs couldn't control. Thibs can't control Jaime Jaquez Jr. sliding in front of Julius Randle. That's not anything he can control. OG Anunoby popping his shoulder, his elbow, or whatever the hell happened to him in January. It's not anything he can control. It's the reaction to these things that he can control. It's collapsing the minutes that are now available onto the guys already into the rotation and driving them pretty much into the ground, and then setting them up to have a higher chance of getting injured going forward. These are the things that he can control. It's the things we talk about in the playoffs. It's waiting until game 3 to get Deuce McBride on Tyrese Maxey and taking OG Anunoby off Tyrese Maxey. There are trade-offs with anything, as we've said many times. This is not saying that Tom Thibodeau does nothing well. It's overall in the net, in the macro, are the trade-offs enough? And are his warts and his biases manageable enough that you can win a championship with this guy as your head coach? I'm not 100% convinced that you are, and I don't think we learned anything different this postseason.
Yeah, I hear everything that you're saying. I think I pretty much fall on your side of things. I mean, if anything, I think I'm more skeptical than you are about kind of moving forward with Thibs as the head coach and the potential to I think Thibs would definitely be awesome for maintaining the floor for this team and always having them in contention. I think that for sure. But when we're talking about
and yeah. I'm sorry, actually, to cut in. I just want to say, to be clear, that could just be enough, because we've said this, we've talked about this before. If a Thibs team in the playoffs has an X% chance of making the playoff, of winning the championship, and a team with somebody else coaching it has a Y% chance of winning the championship, but Thibs is more likely to give you more bullets in the chamber, that could just be enough. I'm not saying I think that, but I do want to be fair to both sides. I'm not saying it's a slam dunk case. Maybe you think it's a slam dunk case, but I do want to kind of steelman the opposing perspective, because I don't want anybody who's listening to this who's like a Thibs guy or whose intuition says, yeah, I don't think it's reasonable to think that Thibs shouldn't be the coach. I personally think there's decent amount of rational to the other side, and I want to be fair to those people too. I don't want them to be completely put off,
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. My opinion is more like, if it was baseball, if it was a sport like baseball, I would agree, right? Like, let's just get into the postseason. Let's always get there. Let's have a pretty good seed and let's see how things play out, hopefully. But like, to me in basketball, it's like you have more control over whether you win or not, depending on how you strategically approach it. And I think that the Knicks have to operate. We're kind of talking about the Knicks like future situation. Maybe we could loop back to the series if we want, but like, to me, this is about their future. And like, I think that they're in an amazing spot, but they have difficult decisions to make. I think that's one of them. I think that they're going to make the decision that they're going to make, which is to extend Thibs. But the next set of things that they could do could be the difference between kind of like being this low level kind of dark horse contender perpetually, or being one of the title favorites. And I do think the cool thing for Knicks fans is that like Leon Rose and his staff have built such a good team that they have a super high floor. That part is incredible. But moving forward, regardless of what, they do, they need to start operating like a true contending team, like 100%. And to me, this consists of like 3 components. So one, they definitely need to re-sign their most important players from this year, which primarily includes OG Anunoby and Isaiah Hartenstein. 2, they need to pursue players that clearly raise their ceiling now if they're available, like when we could talk about some people if we want to, but if they're possible to acquire players like that might be like star or superstar level players. Or, and I know Schwinn has been talking about this on some Strickland pods, they need to pursue players that would be key, like well-fitting players that are like last piece of the puzzle kind of guys, like a Caruso, who Schwinn and I have both loved forever. Caruso, in my opinion, is the best perimeter point of attack defender in the entire NBA and has been for several years. And 3, this is like speaks to what we've been talking about. They have to plan for a long playoff run. Like you have to intend to say at the end of this year, we're going to be in the playoffs and we have 16 games to win. It's not just about getting there. It's about getting all the way through. And I know that load management is like a horrible word in the Knicks community. And I know everyone insists that like minutes has nothing or very little to do with the injuries that the Knicks sustained. Oh, higher workload increases your risk of injury. Like research supports this. This is the case. It's also just deductively true, as I've talked about for years. More time on the court increases, exposure to injury risk. This is just deductive logic. Like this is absolutely true. I think that the minutes lows were likely less relevant to, or likely more relevant to the OG and Josh Hart injuries at the very least. But regardless, even if guys didn't get injured, even if they didn't get injured based on, not getting enough rest, the point is that they were more likely to. Like, I think that a higher workload, even if a higher workload and fatigue didn't contribute to the injuries this year, the Knicks were kind of fortunate in a way that was the case. They were unfortunate because they experienced like a sensible freak accident injuries, but they were also fortunate that they didn't experience more injuries or injuries sooner related to overburdening people's bodies. Like, and I don't care. I don't care about load management or whatever. I don't care what you call it. That's not important to me. It's fine if guys don't miss games, but minutes matter. Minutes accumulate wear and tear. People talk about Brunson's usage being unsustainable. Maybe it is. I don't necessarily disagree that his usage at what it's been is unsustainable, but I don't see how his usage is unsustainable, but his high minutes load is not. That's totally sustainable, but the usage is. Like at the end of the day, the team is a contender when they're healthy, and they need to operate as such. The point is, you do whatever you have to do to have your guys be as healthy as possible in the highest leverage situations. The Mavs in the conference finals, they're missing Maxi Kleber, who is out of their rotation, a low-end rotation player. The Pacers in the conference finals, they're missing only Ben Mathurin out of their rotation, up-and-down player. I think was probably a net negative overall in the season. He was coming on a little bit late before the injury, but not a huge loss for them. The Timberwolves in the conference finals, not missing anyone from their rotation, completely healthy up and down. The Celtics in the conference finals, they're missing Kristaps Porzingis, who tends to be injury prone, but they're so good they can afford to sustain an injury to a key player and still be successful against lower level teams in the Eastern Conference. Health is essential, and in the playoffs, you need to do whatever you can to increase the probability that your players get healthy in the playoffs. Like it doesn't always work. It doesn't mean it'll always work, but you may rest guys and they may get injured anyway, or some guys may play a ton of minutes and not get injured. But the point is you need to maximize your probabilities, and that's key for the Knicks. And if, Thibs is not going to have that approach, the organization has to have that approach, because that is important. You have to look at this coming season as we're a title contender. How do we operate as such? How do we make sure our guys are healthy and ready for a playoff run? And in some cases, in many cases, that goal is more important than whatever happens in the regular season. And a regular season win in February or December or whatever the case may be. So I'm not sure that, in my opinion, that's one thing that I'm not sure that Thibs is the guy to do. And if he's not, and they re-sign him, which I think they're going to no matter what, then they need to put in some guardrails to make sure that happens.
And the number one pushback I see to this is what I mentioned earlier. The first domino to fall wasn't fatigue related. It was a freak injury. It was Randle, getting slid under by Jaime Jaquez. And it was OG Anunoby having a weird elbow injury that probably wasn't related to him. People are going to get hurt. That happens to every team in every season. It is impossible for all 9 of the Knicks rotation players to play all 82 games. And so if you're saying, oh, well, look at the minutes per game that people were averaging when things were perfect, that's easy. That's every single defensive Thibs I ever see is just, well, what if coaching didn't matter? What if the Knicks had 9 really good players who played every game? Then this wouldn't be a problem. Yeah, that doesn't happen for any team in the entire league. That never happens. It's never going to happen for the Knicks. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. So you have to adjust your expectations. And when these things happen, you have to do stuff that maintains the goals that XJ was just talking about. So, like, yes, Tom Thibodeau wants to win every single basketball game he coaches. That is a fact. Most coaches want to do that. I promise you, Joe Mazzulla, when he's playing Luke Cornett 20 minutes a game, he's not thinking, oh man, Luke Cornett gives me the best chance of winning this basketball game. But he's also not thinking, oh man, I don't give a shit about this basketball game. He's trying to balance those two ideas. He's trying to balance the idea that this basketball game, setting a good foundation, that's important. But the ultimate goal is winning a championship. He's trying to balance those two things. That is the most important thing. When Julius Randle and OG Anunoby get hurt, and Mitchell Robinson's already out because Mitchell Robinson is an injury-prone player. That happens. You can't have a game in January where the Knicks win by 15 against the Rockets and Isaiah Hartenstein plays 41 minutes and OG Anunoby plays 43 minutes. That does not, it is impossible that is maximizing the long-term goal of winning a championship. It just is, because it's not something that just happens once. If you're doing it once, it means you're going to compromise again and again and again. People can have the best of expectations, the best of intentions, but if you let them compromise once, that's going to be in their head that it's okay, and it's going to happen again and again and again. And if you look at these box scores, you look at the January box scores, the February box scores, when OG and Randle are out, and you look at how Thibs reacted to those injuries and how he collapsed the minutes, it's just not a sustainable method of maximizing your chance of winning a championship. It's not a sustainable method of making sure that your players are peaking when the playoffs start.
Yeah, I agree. I think the key point here is that the Knicks are entering and really have entered, since they acquired OG Anunoby, a phase where they have a genuine opportunity to potentially win a title here. Like the team is so good. Leon Rose and company have really put together and assembled such an elite, I've said this before, an elite group of players. Not any individual player is like elite, even though obviously Brunson's elite, and offensively OG is elite, defensively all these other things, but all taken all together, this is an elite team of guys in grouping in terms of how they work synergistically, if they, given the specific lineups and rotations. And they're entering a situation where now you have real expectations. And I understand if you're just like, hey, we're going to do the best we can this year, get as far as we can. We're going to instill a culture. We're going to instill a culture of every game matters. We're taking no nights off, all of those kinds of things. Cool. I think that's great for culture building and all of that stuff. Now you're in a different phase, and now you have to make that transition. Now it's like, now we have one goal, and our goal is to win a title. And how do we best set ourselves up to win that goal? And you may disagree. You may think that it's, I don't know. I was going to say, I was trying to steelman a position where like, people may feel like the regular season is more important than like being healthy in the postseason, but I can't come up with a theoretical framework where I think that that's the case. So I think you just have to prioritize that. And you may say, well, are guys more likely to get hurt if they take nights off? Like that's truly like unsupported by any research or data. And so I don't think you can say, well, we don't want to rest guys because that might make it more likely that they get hurt. And I'm not even saying you rest them. I'm saying you just need to monitor and manage minutes and not strain folks and strain their bodies to the extent that they're more likely to get hurt. Again, this is all probabilities. What is more likely to happen? Is a guy more likely to get hurt if they play, 42 minutes a night, or if they play 35 minutes a night? It seems to be very clear that they're more likely to get hurt. I mean, they are more likely to get hurt if they play 42 minutes a night based on exposure to injury risk, but even just based on wear and tear, they're more likely to get risk based on any available information and research that we have. So you got to just balance that. Maybe you'll lose 3 more games in the regular season, but that's a worthwhile trade-off. It has to be a worthwhile trade-off if you're really looking at being a title contender. And I think that the Knicks are entering that phase right now. That's where they're at. That's what it will be next year, whether they come run it back with this same team or they make a big deal. And we may talk about like things that they may look to do. Regardless, that's where they're at. And so that's the way that you have to play it from now on. And, again, I think Thibs will be back. I think Thibs is going to extend no matter what. And I question the decision just because I don't know that he's the person to really have this like kind of long-term over short-term perspective. And if not, something has to happen. There has to be, guardrails in place by the organization to ensure that guys are not being overplayed and that this priority is, there's a reconciliation between Thibs's desire to win every game in the regular season and any game that he ever plays in and the organizational goal of winning a championship. And I hope that they're able to institute that.
For sure. And you mentioned, Leon Rose, the team that him and the front office have put together. Of all the good things about this healthy roster going into next season, I think possibly the most remarkable is the versatility of so many of the players. There are so few players in this rotation that are locked into, a single position. So, bring back this past January, this past February, you see the minutes that some of these players were playing when the injuries happen. And then you look at the bench and you see Quentin Grimes having nights where he plays 15 minutes. And it's like, okay, well, Thibs only saw him as a shooting guard. He didn't like, Fred Katz said this. Fred Katz said Tom Thibodeau didn't like the idea of Brunson, DiVincenzo, and Grimes. He thought it was too small. Okay, well, I disagree with that, but that's not an issue anymore. We know he values Josh Hart's versatility. You have all these guys, OG Anunoby. You have these guys who Thibs has shown a willingness to play multiple positions. Minutes, giving yourself the best chance to win and managing minutes shouldn't be antithetical anymore. This should be a very, very feasible thing in these games where, the Knicks are healthy or mostly healthy. I think the Knicks fans should have an expectation of next year just going smoothly. Now, of course, things don't work out that way. I'm sure an injury will catch us off guard. But the point is that there should be an expectation of a team that knows it's a title contender and is doing everything it can to maximize its title chances. Not everything it can to maximize its chances of beating Washington in a game in December. It's cool that they do that. It's cool that the Knicks don't, lose those games or take those games lightly anymore. They were one of the best teams in the league against bad teams last season. And coming from a place where, everyone remembers 2003 through 2020, basically, aside from a couple seasons, coming from that long a period of ineptitude, I understand and I'm sympathetic to people who just can't get beyond, man, it's nice to have a coach who just gives a shit and gets his players to give a shit every night. But they've built something real here, something real and sustainable, and there just have to be the bigger goals have to be prioritized.
Yeah, and I think the last thing, at least I want to say about it is you kind of implied this or suggested toward this as well. I definitely think Thibs deserves like unbelievable credit for building this culture where, every game matters, where they fight no matter what, where they're extremely physical and they're tough. There's no quit at all in them. And that stuff really matters when you get to the playoffs. I also think the players that they have those perspectives as well on their own. I mean, we know from the Villanova players championship pedigree that that's kind of an attitude that they brought to the NBA as well. And so it's a really nice mesh where both the players have that perspective and they buy in, and the coach has that perspective and is buying in, and there's buying all around and everybody's on the same page. I love it. And I think that that's really great. And I think that culture that they've built is very solid and solidified, and that'll help them moving forward. But I think that you have to understand when moving from one phase into another, and now they are moving into another phase. And to me, it just is, I don't know, it's just important that they recognize that and that they build it out accordingly. And I made the comparison, from Thibs to like a Mark Jackson. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. What I mean by that is Mark Jackson brought in, culture, principles, defensive toughness, attention to detail, all these things that really, really matter, when you're competing and trying to win at the highest level. And you bring that in and you establish that. But it's like, now, okay, this team is really, really good. We're entering a new phase. What do we do from here? Do we just continue with those principles and like hope that takes us over the top? Or do we say, okay, we have that locked in and now we need this kind of trading short-term benefits for long-term benefits. We need this kind of foresight, this macro vision, and some of those approaches. We need those more than we do, some of those other cultural things. And I think Thibs is a better coach than Mark Jackson, but I do think that there is a potential for having someone who can bring in some other things that are more needed now that we've moved on to this next phase. I think it's really cool for the Knicks that they have moved on to this next phase. And I think most people would agree there's real expectations on this team moving forward. It's no longer like it'll be nice to get to the second round. It is like you got to advance. You got to get far into the playoffs, whether it's the Eastern Conference Finals, whether it's the finals, whether it's winning a championship. But I think that that's really where the baseline expectation starts for the team. And I think that that's an exciting spot for the Knicks, but I think that that's where they are at. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that.
I definitely agree with that. I just want to say that anyone who takes the Mark Jackson comparison as like this huge insult, I know Mark Jackson has some personal skeletons in his closet, but you're not recalling what a clusterfuck the Warriors situation was in 2011. 4 years after the crazy 2007 postseason when they, as the 8th seed, beat the 67 or 6 whatever, lots of wins Mavericks 1 seed. They upset them. Everybody remembers that Warriors team. The Warriors as a franchise in those next ensuing 4 seasons fell off a cliff to the point that ownership was booed at half court. They had ownership and, a former player getting presented with something at half court or during halftime, and the fans booed them. It was that miserable to be a Warriors fan then. And Mark Jackson came in and he effectively did what Thibs did with the Knicks in 2020, 2021. They won a playoff series in 2012, 2013. They beat the Nuggets in a super exciting 6-game series. And that only took Mark Jackson, a couple seasons. He did it with defense. He did it with accountability, got his guys to show up every night. Of course, it helped that Steph Curry stopped being hurt and started being Steph Curry, but he did build something there. And one of the most jarring statistics about the Mark Jackson era is in 2013, 2014, the Warriors were last in passes in the entire NBA. A team with Steph Curry and Klay Thompson and Andre Iguodala and David Lee and Draymond Green, all these connective pieces who want to move around, who are best moving around, last in passes. They loved, finding a mismatch and ISOing against it. And the Warriors front office, despite being ahead of schedule and despite coming off, a 2012, 2013 where they beat the Nuggets in 6 and then took a great Spurs team to 6 games in the second round, and then the next season took a great Clippers team to 7 games in the first round and lost a tight Game 7 in LA, the Warriors front office had the wherewithal to say, okay, this is good, but we're trying to be great here. We can win a championship with Steph Curry. Jalen Brunson ain't Steph Curry. I mean, look, Jalen Brunson's proven me wrong a million times before. If he ends up being, top 10 player of all time like Steph Curry, he'd be proving me wrong again. I don't think it's an insult to say Jalen Brunson is not peak Steph Curry. But Jalen Brunson is really, really fucking good. Pardon my French. He's a really, really fucking good basketball player. You can win a championship if you put the right pieces around him. The Knicks should be like what the Warriors were thinking in 2014. They should see title expectations, and I think they should hold themselves accountable to that standard.
Yeah, fully agree. And we're talking about, with that in mind, there's just going to be questions naturally about what the Knicks will do moving forward. I mean, there's a lot of directions that they could go in. There's a lot of things that they can do. There's a lot of levers that they can pull. And to me, the biggest question, maybe you disagree, but for me at least, the biggest question is surrounding Julius Randle. Entering the last year of his contract before he has a player option that he almost certainly won't pick up unless something goes horribly wrong. Where do the Knicks go from here? So let's take for granted, Geoff, that they retain their key free agents, Hartenstein and OG. Let's just say that it happens, which, you've mentioned several times that that's not a guarantee by any stretch. And I agree. I think OG feels like closer to a guarantee, but it's not a guarantee. Hartenstein feels now, with how he's played, there may be like some big time suitors. So we'll see how that goes. But let's just take for granted they retain their key free agents. Are they running it back with Julius Randle and just adding another piece like a Caruso, like a Malcolm Brogdon, like I don't know, a Dorian Finney-Smith, someone like that, just another ancillary piece that can play defense and shoot threes, a Jordan McLaughlin potentially at the point guard, some a player like that who fits the Thibs mold, can play defense, can make threes, maybe can dribble a little bit. Or are they trying to trade Randle, replace him with a secondary creator who is more of a synergistic fit with Brunson in that he can do some creation for sure, but is better off ball and can defend a little better, like a Paul George, a player like that. I don't know. Where are you with what you're thinking Knicks should do and what do you think they will do?
I think the Knicks are going to run it back. I think they're going to have Randle and Brunson and OG and Hartenstein and Dante and Josh Hart and Deuce and Mitch. I think I'd be surprised if those 8 guys aren't on the team to start next season. And to be honest, I think they're justified in doing that. I mean, we can talk about optimization versus what makes sense, but the truth of the matter is the Knicks know that this is a winning formula. They have January with, OG after the OG trade with Hardenstein and Randle healthy, where they just blitzed opponents. You and I can talk about, how responsible, divvy out the responsibilities for that success. And we can talk about what's optimal. And that we mostly fall on the same side of this. But Randle's given them too much, and he's not a negative, obviously. He's just where you and I take issue is he as big a positive as he should be given his individual impact? And is there a way to optimize better? If you replace him with Paul George, like you mentioned, look, forget fit. Paul George was miles better than Randle last season when healthy. Like, I don't think people realize how good Paul George is. I know he has the playoff P stink around him. So Paul George is really, really good. He's really good at basketball. People act like it's some insult that, to say Julius Randle's worse than him. It's not. It's not an insult. This guy is still, he's reaching the end of his prime, but he's still a very, very impactful basketball player. But even if he wasn't, even if him and Randle were in a vacuum, around the same impact, the way he profiles, the way he provides his impact, it's a little bit less on ball. It's a little bit more catch and shoot. And there's a lot more defense. These are things that coincide with a Jalen Brunson built team a little bit better. So I think if we were talking about optimizing the team, it would be reasonable and maybe even best to say that the Knicks should move on from Julius Randle. But I think that given what Randle has given to the Knicks, and given the fact that even in spite of the diminishing returns that Randle might bring, and I do think the front office is aware of it. I think that's why you hear even rumors of the Knicks are going to see what they can get for Randle. I think they're aware of the suboptimal fit. But I think in spite of that, ultimately they'll choose to give this team a fair shake. And I don't think I could begrudge them for doing that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I definitely think if we were handicapping it, the Knicks running it back would definitely be the most likely thing to happen. And part of that reason is I think there is a status quo bias. Like, I think there's a bias where it's like, well, let's just maintain the thing that's working already. We know it's working. Let's not try to shake things up, because it looks bad. Like, optically, if you change things, you go in a different direction and suddenly you're not successful. That's a big loss from an optical standpoint. So there is a status quo bias towards the kind of risk averse aspect of, okay, we bring in Paul George, things don't work well. Everybody says, man, why didn't you run it back? You had Randle, you had January, you went 14-2, you were unstoppable. He got hurt, a freak injury, and there was no reason that you couldn't win a championship that way. So I think from that standpoint, I think that just plays on actual humans. I think that the human decision is to say, what's you're laughing.
I was just gonna say it's kind of like why coaches punt instead of going for it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like even if the numbers are close and it says like it's a close call, but you should go for it. It's easier to make an excuse or to not take accountability if you just punt. Like, oh, well, punting would have worked if the defense just got a stop, And so it's easier for the Knicks front office to fade criticism if they just keep the status quo, because as I alluded to, they have every justification to keep the status quo.
Yep, it's totally justifiable, and they actually won't get any slack or pushback for it. So I think for all those reasons, I think that Leon Rose and everyone else, they're really bright in the front office. But at the same time, I think that people are self-motivated. They want to keep jobs. They want to, like they're not going to say, hey, this is riskier, but it gives us the best chance to win by 5%, or by 10%. Like I don't think that's enough to go in a direction like that.
We would get like our if we were like co-GM somewhere, the range of outcomes would be so volatile. Like we'd get fired within a year, or like I do want to before I turn it back over to you, I want to shout out a guy. I know nothing about him, but a guy just replied on Twitter in a thread that I'm tagged in, and he basically says the exact same thing you say. His name's Steve D. He says somebody suggests, replacing Randle with Paul George, and he says, but why would we do that? What makes us think that Paul George OG is much better than OG Randle, especially with Paul George's injury history? And if so, how much better? I think you keep the starting core together, and then you try to get a more reliable bench scoring piece. I'm not saying he's right, but I do think that that's basically what you were saying. Like that's what you were saying, that how the front office is going to rationalize it. Like sometimes optimizing is riskier than maintaining the status quo. And the thing about that is that's only defensible if the status quo is still good enough. And I think we both agree that even though Julius Randle isn't the optimal power forward, the status quo is still good enough to contend for a championship.
Yeah, I think so. I do think so. And at least in my opinion, like maybe I'm a little bit of a robot here with these kinds of things, but if I have a 10% better chance of winning, I want the 10% chance of better winning. Even if the downside is like the floor falls out, like I just fall through the floor and I go to the bottom of the earth. Like I still want that. I want that additional opportunity. I mean, I think even like my approach to something like, this is just a quick anecdote. My approach to something like fantasy football is like, I typically will just trade for everyone's injured players who are really, really good, who they'll basically sell for a discount, because I think that you need to stack the deck so heavily in your favor to like basically have a better chance than just like luck to win in fantasy football. You have to have like an overwhelming team, and the only way to do that is to get people at a value at a discount value. And so I'll just like pursue everybody's injured players and just like hope that they come back, because if they come back, I'll be the overwhelming favorite. And I think that that's how you kind of have the best chances to win. But if not, if those guys don't come back, then I just blew my team. And like so to me, it's either I'm gonna finish in last or I'm gonna finish in first. But like having a high likelihood of finishing third to last does nothing for me. I don't care about it. It's just like it's the same as finishing last. I don't know if I watch too much Fast and the Furious movies, but that's like my approach to it. So, I want to say realistically, I would operate this way, but I don't think it would be probably as justifiable from, a big organizational standpoint with, ownership wanting certain outcomes, the fan base wanting certain outcomes, the kind of heat that you would take for it. I just don't think it's reasonable. So I do think they'll run it back. I think what I would do is I probably lean in favor of going Paul George. Paul George is 34 years old. If it was feasible to acquire him, I just think that lineup, let's say Brunson, DiVincenzo, Paul George, OG Anunoby, and Isaiah Hartenstein, it's just too flawless. It's from a synergistic point.
It's a perfect lineup.
It's a perfect lineup. And so though, if you get to the playoffs and those guys are healthy somehow, and clicking pretty well, you're the title favorite, in my opinion. You're the title favorite. And that's worth it to me, to take the risk of like things falling apart. But yeah, in the real world, people, organizations aren't going to do that, I think, for the most part. So I don't anticipate it happening.
I think the more interesting player comp and potential trade is Mikal Bridges, because Mikal Bridges is Paul George light, in almost every way, as a shooter,
light.
Like he profiles very similarly to Paul George, a little worse at the initiation, worse at the shooting, worse at the defense, but
he's worse at everything than Paul George, though.
He's worse at everything than Paul George, but he does check the same boxes and he does profile the same. I do think, and this probably will upset Knicks fans, I do think that the Knicks get better as a team if you replace Bridges with, replace Randle with Bridges. But again, it's a risky proposition. My assumption is if they look at Bridges, they're going to try to bring him in alongside the core that they have, which I'm not sure how they'd pull off. I assume Mitchell Robinson would be in that deal, and maybe Boyan. Let's talk a little bit about Randle, rather than the macro theoretical part. Let's talk a little bit about why, we feel this way and what he's lacking, what type of player he is. I see a lot of things being thrown around. There are people who say, oh, people forget how good Randle is. Look, you can group anyone you want. We don't forget how good Randle is. Randle's awesome. Great basketball player, all-star. And then there's this stigma that like, oh, you think he's like selfish. No, I don't think that either. I just don't think he's a great natural fit next to Jalen Brunson. I think it's just as simple as that. I think we saw Jalen Brunson as the best version of himself pretty much immediately when Randle went down. And I think that's because Brunson, as good as he is off ball, shout out to DJ Zulo, who brought that up. Brunson made a huge leap this year off the ball. Great off-ball player. He's shooting as well as he ever has. He's moving as well as he ever has. But I still do think the ideal, team construction when you're running an offense with Brunson on the team has him with the ball in his hands as much as possible. He's just so crafty with the ball in his hand. He draws so much attention. He makes everyone who shares the court with him, your life is easier if you share the court with Jalen Brunson. And so, yes, do you need someone who can spell him when, he can't just create offense every time down? That's unrealistic. Do you need someone who can create offense? Yes, you do. Do you need someone who can create offense when he's not on the court? Because we talked about minutes earlier. Jalen Brunson can't play 48 minutes a game. I'm aware of that. So yes, you do need that. I'm not saying that a second creator isn't important at all. And that's where Julius Randle was missed immensely this postseason in the non-Brunson minutes. The impact data shows that. It shows that even though the offense was as good as it's ever been in the playoffs overall, it was dreadful when Jalen Brunson wasn't on the court. It was worse than it's ever been. And that's because they didn't have that second creator. That's totally a reasonable perspective. I get that. But the question that me and XJ have is Randle returning enough value overall if his primary value is the 10 or so minutes that Jalen Brunson isn't playing and the few possessions when Jalen Brunson isn't playing, but he doesn't need the ball in his hands. And I think XJ thinks that position would be more maximized if it was a guy like Paul George, a guy like Mikal Bridges, a guy who can do the things Julius Randle does, granted not as well. He can't create offense as well. But what you're trading off when you take a step down in going from Julius Randle as an initiator to Paul George or Mikal Bridges as an initiator, you more than make up for when you get the shooting, the defense, and the spacing that they give back.
Yeah, I think that was flawlessly summarized. I don't even have a ton to add to it because that's the perspective, right? And I really appreciate that. First, you kind of disposed with some of the narrative stuff that we hear, forgetting how good Randle is or thinking that Randle's selfish, or like you said, I'm not forgetting how good Randle is. It's not a matter of my poor memory, which I do have a poor memory, but I'm not forgetting how good Randle is. Randle is an excellent player. Like, again, like you said, all-star level, fringe all NBA level, depending on his role and its circumstances. That is not the issue. The issue is exactly what you said. And I just think that Brunson has shown an ability to anchor an offense, to anchor a high level offense, and his most impactful ability, despite that, his improvements as an off ball player, there's no like small guard, like off ball players. Like, I mean, maybe Steph Curry to some extent is like can sort of be considered an off ball player, but we talked about like Brunson's not going to be a Steph Curry like player. And even Steph Curry, when he played with Kevin Durant, there was just some friction around who's going to have the ball to some extent. And I just think that, I don't know, I do think that the Knicks offense, and we've seen offenses around the league really operate at such a high level when there's a primary initiator and everybody fits around that player and accentuates that player and either makes it so that the defense has to deal with that player as a threat in an unadvantageous situation, or has to allow an advantage to the offense and allow them to kind of the other players to score in situations where they're either like no one's covering them, there's a rotation to them and it's late, some kind of situation where there's another advantage on the court. And I think because we've seen these dynamics, that is part of what's informing this belief that Randle, while he's very excellent on the ball and can do a lot, and Brunson is very good off the ball as well, Randle is not good enough off the ball and defensively to make up for that. And so I think that we would need to see somebody who brings those other kinds of skills. And to be honest with you, I'm not positive that Bridges is like clearly there to me. He probably is.
I respect that for sure. I do think it's close. I just want to get in that in order. It's close to me. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, you're fine. Yeah, it's important. So I'm not positive. I think he is, but I would understand, like, you know, if it's just 1-for-1 Bridges for Randle and nothing else changes, I'm not sure. That feels risky, and I'm not sure about the payoff. I would probably do it again in a theoretical sense, but it doesn't feel like enough of a premium to be like, yeah, we're going to do it. The Paul George thing feels like, yeah, the Paul George is like, this is if this guy can somehow hold up at 34 years old, this is better. And I feel almost no doubt about that in terms of like my belief on what he brings and his ability to create when Brunson's off the court. It's just it's such a match that kind of situation would lead me to do it. Bridges, I probably would, but I could understand pushback on it. And then there are, you know, other players that would work really, really well, but you'd have difficulty acquiring as well. So,
you know what's crazy is think about that 2018, 2019 Thunder team that Paul George, he was third in MVP voting that year. He was third in MVP voting as the second banana to Russell Westbrook.
Yeah.
And that team build is what the Knicks would be.
Yeah.
Like they would be a facsimile of that team, except instead of having two below average players at shooting guard and small forward, they would have OG Anunoby and Dante DiVincenzo. So it's Russell Westbrook, Steven Adams at the 1 and the 5. The Knicks have arguably better versions of both of those players. Like I'm not saying Brunson and Russell Westbrook are similar, but I'm just saying at point guard, I think you can argue that Brunson right now is more impactful than Russell Westbrook was in 2019. And I think you can definitely argue that Isaiah Hartenstein is more impactful than Steven Adams. So they're already ahead. Yeah. Even though Paul George is past prime, but he still profiles the same as he did on that team. So Paul George would be worse. But you're already ahead with Brunson and Hartenstein versus Russell Westbrook and Steven Adams. But now, instead of like Andre Roberson, and I'm sorry, I don't remember that team very well, but I know that they never had, that was their whole thing. They spent years trying to find a shooting guard, small forward, anybody who could play a 3-and-D guy, and they never were able to find him. Instead of having, you know, whatever carousel of guys they had at shooting guard and small forward those years, they have Dante DiVincenzo and OG Anunoby, who are like the ideal candidates in those positions. This would be the best team in the NBA, and I feel save you know a transaction that where a super team is built. The Celtics somehow even getting even better. And this is meaningful, by the way, because the Celtics were just by far the best team in the NBA. There's you look at every shred of data, the Celtics were arguably the best team the NBA has seen since the Warriors. That's how good the Celtics were this year. And I am saying, and I mean this, and and everyone who's listening knows that I am a Knicks fan, but I'm not like a biased. Like I do my best to remain objective. I'm going to say what I truly think. I'm not saying this as a Knicks fan. I feel very confident that if you replace Julius Randle with Paul George next year, that the Knicks would be better than the Celtics and would be the best team in the NBA.
Yeah, I agree. I really can't disagree. I mean, you made the case. I agree with it. Obviously,
actually, I'm sorry. I just want to say one more thing about the Julius Randle part, because I can feel you. You know, we have to talk about other things. Some people might say, "Oh, well, why do you think Randle's a bad fit?" Remember January? Remember how good January was? And I had, you know, I don't love to toot my own horn super often, but I had a thread that on Twitter that did really well talking about the synergy of Julius Randle, and I thought it was just I put a lot of effort into it, and I was really proud of it because look, I'm not saying I'm right, but I do take pride in researching and, putting effort into things that I care about. And I put a lot of effort and research into this thread. And one of the things that I touched upon was I posted all of the Wowie data, because people are naturally like, oh, well, they did really well in January. How can you say Julius Randle's a bad fit? And look, first of all, I'm not saying he's a bad fit. So don't be binary. If you're listening to this and you're put off by it, don't put everything into good and bad camps. There are levels to things. And one of the biggest problems with social media right now, I'm sorry for this rant, is that everything becomes binary. So people are going to hear what we're saying right now and be like, oh my God, you guys think you hate Julius Randle and you think he sucks. I promise you, I give you my word, we do not hate Julius Randle. We do not think he sucks. We think we think the Knicks can still win a championship with Julius Randle on this team. That's how much we think of Julius Randle. We're just talking about, is he the best fit? Is there a way for the Knicks to raise the ceiling even higher? And so going back to the Wowie data, if you look at all the combinations of the on-off, you look at 4 guys, Jalen Brunson, Julius Randle, OG Anunoby, and Isaiah Hartenstein, and you look at all of their with or without stuff. The two players who jump out the most are Jalen Brunson and OG Anunoby. Every single combination goes absolutely bananas in a way that represents how good the Knicks were in January, except for the ones where OG Anunoby doesn't play and Jalen Brunson doesn't play. So you look at Jalen Brunson, OG Anunoby, and Isaiah Hartenstein on the court, but Julius Randle off the court. The Knicks outscored opponents by 29 points per 100 possessions. 29 points per 100 possessions. Julius Randle not being on the court didn't move the needle at all. With all 4 of them on the court, 26 points per 100 possessions. You look at it with Julius Randle, Jalen Brunson, Isaiah Hartenstein, but OG Anunoby, they only outscored opponents by 4.7 points per 100 possessions. That is the difference between OG Anunoby and the other 3 being off, OG Anunoby being off and the other 3 being on, and Julius Randle being off and the other 3 being on. This is not disparaging to Julius Randle. This is not saying he's not an all-star, not saying he's not a very good basketball player. It's just talking about optimizing the fit and raising this team's ceiling enough to give them the best possible chance of winning a championship. And again, I'm going to repeat it again. I still think they can win a championship with Julius Randle on the team. I think they'd be more than justified to bring Julius Randle back to being on the team. I think that's a totally reasonable decision. But I feel the need to defend my position, our position, because people push back so hard against it. And again, they think we hate the guy. No, we don't hate the guy. It's just about optimizing the team and giving them the best chance of winning the championship. And I do think it is a reasonable perspective to think that if you got rid of Julius Randle, if you got rid of Julius Randle, the team gets worse. I'm saying that now. But if you replace Julius Randle with a better fitting, similar level impact player, I do think the ceiling can get even higher and the Knicks championship equity can increase.
Yeah, I think that's extremely well summarized. I would add that even if it's a better fitting and slightly lower level impact player, they would still probably get better. And that's the effect of synergy, which we know is a phenomenon that exists in terms of players that mesh well together and that emphasize each other's strengths can create a total that is greater than the sum of its parts. And so that's something that we know that happens. And I think that's the argument here. So extremely well put. Just to add one little note of clarification on that Thunder team, they did have Jeremy Grant, who was really good for them in that season. They didn't have Roberson. The twos that they were playing primarily were Dennis Schroeder and Terrence Ferguson. So I think still definitely.
When did Roberson leave?
The year before. So Roberson's last year was the Carmelo year.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
I remember him I was talking to Fred Katz about him and talked about him having the free throw yips in a playoff series, but that must have been a couple of years before, I guess. I very clearly remember Andre Roberson on those teams. So
yeah. He was there, and he was there along with Corey Brewer as well. So that was
man, that's good. Post prime Corey Brewer getting shooting guard run.
The 31-year-old Corey Brewer was 5th in minutes played per game for that that OKC team.
That Russell Westbrook 2016-2017 season needs to be studied, because it's such an interesting, and we don't have to talk about this a bunch, but it's such an interesting thing that when we talk about maximizing players and putting them in their ideal scenario, Russell Westbrook's ideal scenario is okay, just surround him with a bunch of people who can't do anything so that Russell Westbrook has to do everything, like in a weird way, that was the way to maximize Russell Westbrook. It was just, oh shit, nobody can do anything, so he has to do everything.
Yeah, no, that's funny. It's maximize him by making him have to do everything is really funny.
And he was like,
did.
Yeah, and he did it. And like that's why I say like he just has to be studied, because he's such a unique personality and such a unique engine. He could just do that. Like he is the most uniquely incredible basketball player looking back on it in retrospect. Like just what his motor was like, how much energy and effort he was able to get. Like Thibs would have loved coaching him. A Thibs Russell Westbrook team. Thibs would have found a way to get Russell Westbrook and 4 scrubs to like 55 wins. And that would have been like the most amazing basketball team ever. He would have built a defense. It would have been the We Here Knicks, but like on steroids, because Russell Westbrook would have been like, yeah, Thibs, play me 44 minutes tonight. I don't give a shit. I'll have the ball every possession.
I'm about to close out the pod, but I do want to say, can you guess what Russell Westbrook's assist percentage was in that year, 16-17, or do you already know?
I don't know. So I know Chris Paul has had seasons around like 50%, like 52%. So I would guess like 58%.
Oh, geez. No, 54%, which, but
it wasn't that high.
I don't think there's ever been a 58%. I don't know. We have to look into that, but yeah, it's up there. It's just absurd. 54%, 100% on NBA. But what I will add, you mentioned Russell Westbrook playing for a Thibs team. Russell Westbrook played less than 35 minutes per game in that season. So, still somehow wasn't on the court for 13 minutes of every game.
Man, I feel it compelled. I'm pretty sure that year, I mean, if he's only playing 35 minutes a game, I'm confident of it. I have to look it up. But the on-off data must have been crazy, right? Like it must have been just absolutely bananas how bad they were without him. So when Russ played, they won their minutes by 4.5 points per 100. And when they lost by far a team worse 7.5 points per 100. So, it's not like Jokic, but it is.
Yeah, it's a lot, but
that is a lot.
That the rest of that team was really bad. I mean, like I said, but anyway, this was an interesting discussion around this. Hopefully, I'm sure that people who listen to this, I'm sure that nobody will kind of take exception to this. Everybody will completely good faith be open to our our argument related to Julius Randle and why we could imagine scenarios where the Knicks could be better with a player who's not quite as good as Julius Randle, but is better fitting. But hopefully people are genuinely open to it. And we're not sitting here saying that this is definitely true, but I think that there's a very compelling argument for it. And Paul George, especially being one, given that Paul George is not only a better fit, but also is just better than Julius Randle as well, even in his age 34 season. So we'll see what the Knicks do. We have tons of more content that we'll be producing, podcasts still coming out. Not going to end with the Knicks season. So stay with us, and appreciate everyone who's subscribed. Any last words that you want to add, Geoff?
No, I thought you did. I thought you gave a good epilogue or whatever. You closed it out great, and I thought I heard it quite well. So,
all right, I'm glad it was well heard by you, and hopefully it was well heard by our audience. Hopefully that is something that happened as well. This has been Hot Hand Theory.